Your family made over $1 million from your political connections, while you lecture Americans about corruption. The words detonated in the Senate Banking Committee hearing room like a verbal grenade, each syllable calculated to destroy. Congresswoman Maxine felt the color drain from her face as Senator Ted Cruz continued reading from documents she had hoped were buried forever in the archived files of Washington's institutional memory. Your husband owned $350,000 in One United Bank stock. You personally arranged the Treasury meeting. The bank received $12 million in taxpayer bailout funds. Waters sat motionless, her mouth slightly open, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her as if she could will herself to disappear through sheer force of concentrated thought. The woman who had dominated congressional banking hearings for 34 years, who had stared down Treasury secretaries and corporate CEOs without flinching, who had built her reputation on fierce confrontation and moral superiority, was being systematically dismantled on live national television by a senator she had dismissed 45 minutes earlier as an intellectually lightweight constitutional theorist from Texas. But how did we arrive at this moment of complete political annihilation? Rewind the clock. 45 minutes before Cruz detonated his documentary bomb, the most powerful woman in American financial regulation walked into the Russell Senate office building with the confident stride of someone who had never lost a banking debate in over 3 decades of congressional combat. Maxine was not just attending another oversight hearing. She was planning a public execution, a carefully choreographed destruction of Republican opposition to her progressive banking agenda, broadcast live across every major news network in America. She had personally requested this hearing, had strategically positioned friendly journalists in the gallery, had coordinated with Democratic committee members to ensure a unified assault on conservative financial policy. This was supposed to be her coronation moment, her demonstration of unassailable expertise and moral authority. When she saw Ted Cruz's name on the witness list, she actually laughed out loud, a sharp bark of dismissive amusement that her staff would remember with horror in the days that followed. "He's just a junior senator," she told her chief of staff with casual contempt. "A constitutional theorist who thinks reading old documents makes him qualified to discuss modern economic policy." This will be entertaining. What Congresswoman Waters did not know, what her staff had failed to discover despite weeks of preparation, what the entire Democratic establishment would learn to their profound regret, was that the quiet man with the rumpled suit and the pocket constitution had spent the previous 3 weeks building a prosecutorial case so comprehensive, so meticulously documented, so devastating in its cumulative weight that it would end her political career in less than 1 hour. Cruz had assembled a team of researchers who had combed through 34 years of financial disclosure forms, ethics committee reports, banking committee transcripts, Treasury Department documents, Federal Reserve communications, and newspaper investigations going back to the 1980s. They had built timelines, cross-referenced dates with stock trades, mapped family connections to banking institutions, documented every conflict of interest, every ethical violation, every moment when Waters had used her position to benefit herself and her family financially. The manila folder sitting innocuously on the table in front of Cruz contained enough explosive material to destroy not just one career, but to call into question the entire system of congressional oversight that had allowed such systematic corruption to flourish unchallenged for decades. Senate Banking Committee hearing room, 10:17 in the morning. The air conditioning was functioning perfectly, maintaining a precisely calibrated 68 degrees despite the June heat outside, and the body heat of over 200 people crammed into the gallery, witness tables, and committee seating. The room itself was a monument to institutional power and American governmental authority. Dark wood paneling harvested from Appalachian forests over a century ago. Burgundy leather chairs worn smooth by generations of senators who had made history and careers in this space. The seal of the United States Senate mounted prominently on the wall behind the committee chairman's elevated position, a constant reminder that the proceedings occurred under the weight of constitutional authority and public trust. 7 C-SPAN cameras positioned at strategic angles to capture every facial expression, every nervous gesture, every moment of triumph or humiliation for eternal archival documentation, and immediate broadcast to millions of Americans. Banks of LED lighting panels that left no shadows, no place to hide, no possibility of concealing discomfort or fear, or the slow realization that one's entire career was collapsing in real time. Maxine Waters entered at precisely 10:17, and her entrance was a carefully choreographed demonstration of accumulated power and institutional dominance. She did not walk alone. She commanded an entourage of 12 people who moved around her with the practiced efficiency of a presidential advance team. 2 junior female staffers in matching navy suits carried leather briefcases embossed with the congressional seal and her office designation. Her lead attorney, a silver-haired partner from one of Washington's most expensive law firms, walked half a step behind her right shoulder, his $1,500 per hour expertise radiating professional confidence. 3 communications directors, each monitoring different social media platforms on their smartphones, ready to spin any comment or confrontation in real time for maximum favorable coverage. A personal photographer to document her expected triumph for official archives and future campaign materials. Her grandson and chief of staff, Michael Moore, carried a tablet computer loaded with talking points and counterarguments for every possible line of Republican questioning. And finally, her senior policy advisor, a former banking regulator who had written much of the Dodd-Frank legislation, prepared to provide technical backup if the discussion became too detailed for generalist politicians to navigate effectively. Waters herself was dressed for conquest. Her suit was a deep royal purple, a color that television consultants had assured her projected authority without aggression, confidence without arrogance. The fabric was Italian wool, custom-tailored by a designer whose services cost more than the average American family earned in 3 months. Her silk blouse was cream-colored, fastened at the collar with a gold brooch shaped like the California state seal, a subtle reminder of her decades representing one of the nation's most powerful congressional districts. Her hair had been styled that morning in a session that began at 5:30 and lasted nearly 2 hours, every strand positioned and secured with professional-grade products that could withstand camera lights and the stress of extended confrontation. Her makeup had been applied by a specialist who understood how LED lighting interacted with darker skin tones, ensuring that she would photograph with clarity and authority, regardless of camera angle or lighting conditions. Diamond earrings caught the light with every movement of her head, expensive without being ostentatious, successful without appearing disconnected from her working-class constituents. A gold watch, a gift from her husband on their 40th wedding anniversary, gleamed on her left wrist, its cost exceeding what many Americans saved for retirement. She walked to the witness table with measured steps, each footfall deliberate and confident, her heels clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that announced dominance and control. She did not glance at the Republican side of the committee. To acknowledge their presence would be to grant them a status they had not earned through what she considered legitimate expertise. She focused instead on the Democratic committee members, offering each a slight nod of recognition and solidarity, the Queen acknowledging her courtiers before battle. Her staff arranged themselves in the seats directly behind her, a wall of professional support and institutional backing. Her lead attorney sat immediately to her right, close enough to whisper urgent advice if the proceedings took an unexpected turn. Her communications team positioned themselves with clear sight lines to their boss, ready to receive signals if she needed a recess or wanted specific information disseminated immediately to friendly journalists. The photographer began documenting her arrival, capturing images of confident power that were supposed to dominate tomorrow's news coverage and Democratic fundraising emails. Waters took her designated seat at the witness table with a controlled movement that suggested both respect for the institution and absolute confidence in her own authority within it. She adjusted the microphone with practiced ease, the gesture of someone who had testified before Congress hundreds of times over 3 decades. She arranged her prepared statement in a neat stack before her, each page printed in large font for easy reading under stress, key phrases highlighted in yellow for emphasis. Her hands rested calmly on the table, no nervous movements, no fidgeting, nothing to suggest uncertainty or vulnerability. Her expression was serene, almost regal, the face of someone who had survived countless political battles and expected to emerge victorious from one more skirmish with inferior opposition. She was Maxine Waters, the most powerful woman in congressional financial regulation, the terror of banking CEOs, the champion of consumer protection, the progressive icon who had outlasted presidents and party leaders through sheer force of will and accumulated institutional power. This hearing was supposed to be a routine demonstration of her dominance, another opportunity to lecture Republicans about their subservience to corporate interests, while positioning herself for an even more influential role in the next Democratic administration. What she did not see, what her overconfidence and her staff's incompetence had blinded her to, was the trap that had been carefully constructed and was now about to spring shut with devastating force. 15 feet away, on the opposite side of the witness table arrangement, Senator Ted Cruz sat in apparent disarray, a study in calculated dishevelment that was itself a weapon of psychological warfare. His suit was slightly rumpled, a light gray that looked like it had been purchased during a previous decade and stored improperly. His tie was loosened at the collar, suggesting discomfort with formal proceedings and institutional pomposity. His reading glasses sat crooked on his nose, threatening to fall off entirely if he moved too quickly. Before him on the scarred wooden table lay that innocent-looking manila folder, its edges worn, its surface marked with coffee stains and margin notes in cramped handwriting that suggested disorganization rather than meticulous preparation. He appeared to be half asleep, his breathing slow and regular, his eyes partially closed, his entire posture suggesting a man who was going through the motions of institutional obligation without particular energy or purpose. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award, a masterpiece of misdirection that would be studied by political strategists for generations. Every element of Cruz's appearance and demeanor had been carefully calibrated to encourage underestimation, to suggest incompetence and irrelevance, to make powerful opponents drop their guard and expose themselves to destruction. He had learned this technique during his years as a prosecutor in Texas, when he had discovered that juries and opposing counsel consistently underestimated the rumpled lawyer who appeared disorganized and slightly confused. By the time they realized their mistake, he had already secured convictions and destroyed their credibility. Now he was deploying the same psychological tactics on the national stage, and Maxine Waters was walking directly into the trap with her eyes closed and her confidence absolute. The committee chairman, Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, gavelled the hearing to order at 10:23, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had conducted thousands of congressional hearings over a career spanning 4 decades. The sound of the gavel striking would echoed through the chamber with ritual formality, a declaration that official business was commencing under the authority of the United States Senate and the Constitution it served. The Senate Banking Committee hearing on oversight of federal financial regulations and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is now in session, Grassley announced, reading from a prepared script that his staff had drafted the previous afternoon. We are honored to have with us today Congresswoman Maxine Waters, the distinguished gentlewoman from California, who has served with distinction on the House Financial Services Committee for many years and has extensive expertise in banking regulation and consumer protection. The phrasing was diplomatic, but carried subtle barbs that political insiders immediately recognized. Distinguished gentlewoman, rather than acknowledging her former position as committee chair. Many years, rather than specifying the actual 3-decade span. Extensive expertise, rather than unquestioned authority. Small linguistic choices that signaled institutional tension and partisan divide. Grassley continued with procedural formalities, establishing the hearing's official purpose and ground rules. The committee has requested Congresswoman Waters' testimony regarding the implementation and effectiveness of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, particularly as it relates to congressional oversight authority and constitutional questions about agency structure and accountability. We will begin with an opening statement from the witness, followed by questions from committee members in order of seniority, with each member receiving 7 minutes for initial questioning. Waters leaned forward toward her microphone, her expression serious but confident, ready to deliver the opening statement her staff had spent 2 weeks crafting, and she had rehearsed a dozen times in her office. But before she could speak, Ted Cruz's voice cut through the chamber, lazy and drawling, with the slow, deliberate cadence of someone who had all the time in the world and no particular urgency about anything. "Mr. Chairman, if I might interrupt before we proceed to opening statements." Grassley looked surprised but nodded. "The chair recognizes Senator Cruz." Cruz appeared to struggle slightly with organizing his papers, fumbling with the manila folder in a way that suggested absent-minded confusion. Several Democratic committee members exchanged amused glances, their expressions communicating what they all thought. This junior senator was about to embarrass himself on national television by violating hearing protocols and demonstrating his ignorance of congressional procedure. Waters herself allowed a slight smile to cross her face, the expression of someone watching an opponent dig his own grave. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Cruz said, his accent thick as East Texas crude oil. "I appreciate the committee's indulgence, and I certainly mean no disrespect to our distinguished witness." But before Congresswoman Waters delivers her prepared remarks about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, I wonder if she might help clarify something that's been troubling me for quite some time now. A fundamental constitutional question that goes to the heart of Congress's authority to create regulatory agencies with the power to write binding rules that have the force of law. The room's atmosphere shifted subtly. This was not the rambling procedural objection that people had expected. Cruz's tone remained casual and deferential, but his words carried intellectual precision that suggested careful thought rather than confused improvisation. Waters felt the first flutter of unease, a primal instinct that something was wrong even though she couldn't yet identify the specific threat. Grassley, uncertain how to proceed, made a decision that he would regret for the remainder of his career. "I suppose there's no harm in a preliminary question before opening statements. Congresswoman Waters, are you willing to address Senator Cruz's constitutional inquiry?" Waters, still confident but now slightly wary, nodded. "Of course, Mr. Chairman. I'm always happy to educate my Republican colleagues about the Constitution, particularly when they seem confused about basic governmental authority." The condescension in her voice was unmistakable, the tone of an expert dealing with a slow student who needed remedial instruction. It was exactly the wrong response, delivered with exactly the arrogance that Cruz had anticipated and hoped to provoke. Cruz removed his reading glasses and polished them slowly with a handkerchief he pulled from his jacket pocket, the gesture buying time and building tension while appearing completely innocent. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its lazy drawl, becoming slightly sharper and more focused, though still maintaining a surface appearance of casual inquiry. "Congresswoman Waters, I appreciate your willingness to provide constitutional education. Perhaps you could start by explaining which specific clause of the Constitution grants Congress the authority to create an agency like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that can write binding regulations without specific legislative authorization for each rule, whose director cannot be removed by the president except for cause, and whose funding comes from the Federal Reserve rather than through the congressional appropriations process, thereby avoiding the normal checks and balances of congressional oversight." The question hung in the air like a challenge that could not be ignored or deflected with platitudes. It was specific, technical, and went directly to the constitutional legitimacy of an agency that Waters had spent years defending and expanding. Waters felt her carefully constructed confidence waver as she realized this was not going to be the easy triumph her staff had promised. Cruz wasn't asking simple questions that could be answered with talking points. He was asking complex constitutional questions that required actual knowledge of legal precedent and founding principles. She glanced quickly at her attorney, who maintained a professional poker face but whose eyes betrayed concern. Her staff shifted uncomfortably in their seats behind her, suddenly aware that they had not adequately prepared their boss for this line of questioning. "Senator Cruz," Waters began, her voice taking on the sharp prosecutorial edge that had become her trademark during 34 years of congressional combat. "I don't think I need lectures about constitutional authority from someone who spent the last several years defending a president who tried to overthrow American democracy. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau operates under clear constitutional authority granted to Congress to regulate interstate commerce. And I find it remarkable that Republicans suddenly discover constitutional concerns only when federal agencies try to protect consumers from predatory corporate practices." It was a calculated counterattack, designed to shift the conversation from constitutional law, where she was clearly and embarrassingly out of her depth, to partisan political warfare, where she felt more comfortable and confident. The strategy was to make Cruz defend himself and his party rather than continuing to probe her understanding of constitutional principles. Democratic committee members nodded approvingly. This was the Maxine Waters they knew and loved, the fighter who never backed down, who could turn any question into an indictment of Republican hypocrisy and corporate servitude. But it was exactly the wrong tactical decision, the equivalent of a boxer dropping her guard at precisely the moment her opponent was preparing to deliver a knockout punch. Cruz's eyes lit up with something that observers in the gallery would later describe as predatory anticipation, the look of a prosecutor who has just heard the defendant volunteer precisely the incriminating statement he needed to destroy their entire defense. His hand moved deliberately to the manila folder, fingers caressing its worn edge with almost affectionate care. When he looked back up at Waters, his expression had transformed completely. The lazy, rumpled, slightly confused country lawyer was gone, replaced by the Harvard law graduate who had argued 9 cases before the Supreme Court of the United States and never lost. "Congresswoman Waters," Cruz said, his voice now carrying the precise authoritative tone of a law professor addressing an unprepared student who had just revealed fundamental ignorance of the subject matter. "That's a fascinating response. You invoke the Commerce Clause as justification for unlimited regulatory authority, and you question my constitutional credentials while refusing to answer a straightforward question about the specific constitutional basis for an agency structure that multiple federal courts have ruled violates separation of powers principles. But since you've decided to make this about constitutional knowledge and political hypocrisy rather than substantive policy discussion, let's explore both topics in detail. Let's examine very carefully who actually understands the Constitution and who has spent 34 years systematically violating it for personal and family benefit." He opened the manila folder with theatrical precision, the sound of papers rustling clearly audible in the suddenly silent chamber. When he spoke again, his Texas drawl had vanished entirely, replaced by the sharp, clear articulation of a prosecutor presenting damning evidence to a jury. "Let's talk about One United Bank." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The color drained from Maxine Waters' face as if someone had opened a valve and let all the blood flow out of her body. Her confident posture collapsed, shoulders hunching forward defensively. Her hands, which had been resting calmly on the table, now gripped its edge with white-knuckled intensity. Her eyes went wide with an expression that television viewers across America would later describe as pure terror, the look of someone who has just realized they have walked into an ambush from which there is no escape. Every reporter in the gallery who understood Washington politics recognized instantly what had just happened. Cruz had detonated a nuclear bomb with a casualness that made it even more devastating. One United Bank was the scandal that Waters and her staff had spent years trying to bury, the documented proof of corruption that ethics investigators had covered up, the evidence that she had used her congressional position to arrange federal bailouts for a bank in which her family had significant financial holdings. It was the smoking gun that demonstrated Waters was not a champion of working families, but a corrupt politician who had enriched herself and her relatives through systematic abuse of power. Democratic committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly remembering why that bank name sounded familiar and why discussing it in public was something their leadership had explicitly instructed them to avoid at all costs. Waters' staff behind her looked like they wanted to disappear under the table, their faces pale with the realization that their champion was about to be destroyed on national television, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to prevent it. Her attorney leaned in close, whispering urgently in her ear, but Cruz continued speaking with relentless prosecutorial precision, not giving Waters any opportunity to regroup or formulate a defensive strategy. For the benefit of Americans watching at home who may not be familiar with One United Bank, Cruz said, pulling out a document and holding it up for the cameras to capture clearly, let me provide some important context about Congresswoman Waters' record of serving working families and avoiding conflicts of interest with financial institutions. His voice dripped with sarcasm on the phrases serving working families and avoiding conflicts of interest, making it clear that he was about to present evidence that contradicted those characterizations completely. In September 2008, during the height of the financial crisis, when millions of Americans were losing their homes and their savings, Congresswoman Waters personally arranged a meeting between Treasury Department officials and representatives from One United Bank, a minority-owned bank based in her district in California. She called Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson's office directly and specifically requested this meeting, telling them it was to discuss assistance for minority-owned banks that were struggling during the financial crisis. Cruz paused, flipping to another page in his folder with deliberate slowness, building suspense while Waters sat frozen in horror, unable to interrupt, unable to defend herself, unable to do anything except wait for the hammer to fall. What Congresswoman Waters did not disclose at the time, what she carefully avoided mentioning to Treasury officials, and what subsequent investigations revealed only after whistleblowers came forward, was that her husband, Sidney Williams, owned $350,000 worth of stock in One United Bank and had served on its board of directors from 2004 until 2008. The words landed like artillery shells, each fact a separate explosion of documented corruption. Cruz pulled out a financial disclosure form and began reading from it with the precision of an accountant presenting an audit to corporate executives caught embezzling. According to Congresswoman Waters' own mandatory financial disclosure forms filed with the House of Representatives, $350,000 represented between 4.6 and 15.2% of her family's total net worth at the time. This was not a minor investment. This was a significant portion of her family's wealth at risk in a single bank that she then used her official position to help rescue with taxpayer funds. He looked up from the document, his eyes meeting Waters' terrified gaze directly. If One United Bank had failed, as many banks were failing during that crisis, your husband's investment would have become worthless. Your family would have lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So you personally intervened to arrange federal assistance. You used your position as a senior member of the House Financial Services Committee to secure a meeting with Treasury officials. And you never once disclosed your massive personal financial conflict of interest. Waters tried desperately to interrupt, her voice cracking with panic and rage. That's ancient history that has been thoroughly investigated, and I was completely cleared by the House Ethics Committee after a full and comprehensive review of all the facts. It was the defense her lawyers had prepared, the talking point designed to end any discussion of One United by invoking the authority of an official investigation that had supposedly exonerated her. But Cruz was prepared for exactly this response, and he had the documents to demolish it completely. "Ma'am, let's talk about that Ethics Committee investigation that supposedly cleared you," Cruz said, his tone shifting to one of cold fury barely contained beneath a veneer of professional courtesy. "Because the details of that investigation actually prove the opposite of what you just claimed." He pulled out a thick document bound with a blue cover, the official House Ethics Committee report that Waters clearly wished had remained buried forever in congressional archives. The Ethics Committee investigation lasted 3 years and cost taxpayers over $500,000, And do you know what it concluded? Cruz flipped to a specific page he had marked with a yellow tab, his finger tracing the relevant passage as he read. I'm quoting directly from the official report now. The committee found that Representative Waters' actions in arranging the Treasury meeting and her failure to disclose her family's financial interest in One United Bank constituted serious violations of House ethics rules and federal conflict of interest statutes. He looked up at Waters, who was now visibly shaking. Does that sound like you were cleared, Congresswoman? Because it sounds to me like the committee found you guilty of serious violations. Let me continue reading. His voice took on even sharper edge. However, the committee determined that Representative Waters herself may not have been fully aware of all the details of her husband's financial holdings and may have relied on staff members who failed to properly advise her of the conflict of interest. Cruz closed the report with a decisive snap. So you weren't actually cleared. The Ethics Committee found that you committed serious violations of ethics rules and federal law. They simply decided not to recommend disciplinary action because you claimed ignorance. You threw your staff under the bus, particularly your own grandson who worked as your chief of staff, and the committee let you walk away with no consequences. The destruction was surgical and complete. Waters had invoked the Ethics Committee investigation as her defense, and Cruz had just used that same investigation to prove her guilt. But he wasn't finished. The One United scandal was just his opening salvo, the first bomb in an arsenal of documented corruption that he was about to deploy with devastating precision. But let's talk about what actually happened with One United Bank, Cruz continued, pulling out another document. After the meeting you arranged, where Treasury officials were surprised to discover that One United was the only bank being discussed despite your claims that it was about all minority banks. One United Bank received $12 million in federal bailout funds from the Troubled Asset Relief Program, known as TARP. He let that number hang in the air for a moment. $12 million in taxpayer money went to a bank where your family had hundreds of thousands of dollars at risk. Your husband's investment was saved. The bank didn't fail, and your family's wealth was preserved through federal intervention that you personally arranged. Cruz pulled out a calculator and began punching in numbers, his voice taking on the methodical tone of a forensic accountant, presenting evidence of embezzlement to a grand jury. Let's do some simple mathematics for the American people watching at home. Your husband owned $350,000 in One United stock. That stock would have become worthless if the bank failed. Instead, the bank received $12 million in federal funds and survived. Your husband's investment was protected. Now, according to the Ethics Committee's own report, you personally called Treasury officials at least 3 times to push for assistance to One United. You had your chief of staff, your grandson Michael Moore, send multiple emails to bank executives providing them with inside information about the federal assistance process and offering to help them navigate the Treasury Department bureaucracy. He looked directly at Waters, his expression one of complete disgust barely masked by professional courtesy. You used your official position, your taxpayer-funded office, and your congressional authority to protect your family's private financial investments. That's not public service, Congresswoman. That's corruption. That's the definition of corruption. You used public power for private gain. Waters was now crying, tears streaming down her face, her carefully applied makeup beginning to run, creating dark trails down her cheeks that the unforgiving HD cameras captured in excruciating detail for broadcast to millions of Americans. Her attorney was whispering urgently in her ear, but she seemed unable to hear him, locked in a private hell of public humiliation. Cruz showed no mercy. He had waited years for this moment, this opportunity to expose the corruption that had infected Congress for decades, and to demonstrate that even the most powerful politicians could be held accountable when someone had the courage and documentation to challenge them. But the corruption didn't stop with One United Bank, Cruz said, reaching back into his apparently bottomless folder of documented malfeasance. Let's talk about your family business, Congresswoman. Let's discuss how your relatives have made over $1 million through your political connections, while you've spent 34 years lecturing Americans about corporate greed and Republican corruption. He pulled out a newspaper article, yellowed with age but still readable, from the Los Angeles Times dated 2004. According to this investigative report from the LA Times, your daughter Karen Waters has been paid over $1 million by campaigns and political organizations that you've either endorsed or had direct influence over. Your son Edward Waters has received hundreds of thousands of dollars in consulting fees from companies seeking favorable treatment from committees you serve on. Cruz's voice rose with righteous anger. You've turned public office into a family business, Congresswoman. You've systematically enriched your children, your grandchildren, your husband, and your extended family through your political position. And then you have the audacity to stand before the American people and lecture them about corruption and ethics while you're running what amounts to a criminal enterprise out of your congressional office. The chamber was completely silent except for the sound of Waters' quiet sobbing and the mechanical clicking of camera shutters. Democratic committee members sat frozen, unwilling to defend her, unable to challenge Cruz's documented evidence, desperately hoping the hearing would end before they were forced to publicly choose between party loyalty and acknowledging obvious corruption. Republican members watched with grim satisfaction, recognizing that they were witnessing a turning point in American politics, a moment when documented evidence and constitutional knowledge had triumphed over institutional power and partisan protection. The journalists in the gallery were frantically scribbling notes and typing on laptops, knowing they were documenting a political earthquake that would dominate news coverage for weeks. Cruz gathered his documents carefully, stacking them with precise movements that suggested organized thought rather than completion. He was not finished destroying Maxine Waters. The one united scandal and family corruption were just the foundation. Now he was about to move to even more damaging territory. The evidence that Waters had not just profited from corruption, but had actively incited violence against her political opponents, while hypocritically accusing others of exactly the behavior she had encouraged. Senator Ted Cruz allowed a moment of silence to stretch across the hearing room, a theatrical pause that let the weight of his documented accusations settle over the proceedings like fallout from a detonated bomb. Maxine Waters sat motionless, her tear-stained face a mask of humiliation and defeat, her carefully constructed public persona shattered beyond any possibility of repair. When Cruz finally spoke again, his voice had shifted once more, taking on the tone of a disappointed teacher forced to document a student's comprehensive failure. "Congresswoman Waters," he began, his words measured and deliberate, "moments before I began presenting evidence of your systematic corruption, you tried to deflect from answering legitimate constitutional questions by accusing me and my party of defending a president who you claim tried to overthrow American democracy. You specifically referenced January 6th, suggesting that Republicans had incited violence and constitutional violations. Since you raised that topic, let's examine it in detail. Let's compare your record on political violence and incitement to mine and see who actually has blood on their hands." He pulled out yet another document from his folder, and Waters visibly flinched, anticipating another devastating blow, but unable to defend herself or flee the chamber. "On January 6, 2021, Cruz said, reading from a transcript of his own Senate floor speech, "I spoke about the constitutional process for objecting to electoral votes, a process that has been used by Democrats in 2001, 2005, and 2017, without anyone accusing them of insurrection or violence. I specifically and repeatedly called for peaceful, lawful protest within constitutional bounds. I condemned violence. I voted to certify the election results even though I had concerns about election procedures in certain states. I followed the Constitution and the law." He placed that document down and picked up another one, this time a video transcript with timestamp references clearly marked. "But let's talk about your record with incitement, Congresswoman. Let's discuss what you have encouraged over your decades in Congress, particularly during moments of social unrest and political tension." Cruz's voice took on a harder edge, the prosecutorial tone of someone presenting evidence of serious crimes. "On April 17, 2021, you traveled to Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, where violent riots had been occurring for several days. Buildings were burning, businesses were being looted, police officers were being attacked with bricks, bottles, and improvised explosives. The National Guard had been deployed. This was not a peaceful protest. This was organized violence. He held up a photograph showing burning buildings and overturned police vehicles, the image a stark documentation of urban chaos. And what did you tell the protesters, Congresswoman? What message did you deliver to people who were already engaged in violent destruction? Cruz pulled out a video transcript and began reading Waters' exact words, his voice dripping with contempt. Quote, "We've got to stay on the street. We've got to get more active. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know that we mean business." End quote. He looked up at Waters, who had gone pale again despite her tear-stained face. "You told violent rioters to get more confrontational. You told people who were already burning buildings and attacking police officers to make sure they know we mean business. What exactly did you think would happen, Congresswoman? What did you think more confrontational meant in the context of ongoing riots? Either you're incredibly naive about the power and consequences of your words, or you knew exactly what you were encouraging and you wanted violence to escalate." Waters tried to defend herself, her voice weak and trembling. "I was calling for peaceful protest. I never told anyone to be violent. That's a complete mischaracterization of my words." Cruz's response was immediate and devastating. "Ma'am, the trial judge in the Derek Chauvin case, the case that had sparked those riots, specifically cited your comments as potentially prejudicial and grounds for a mistrial. A sitting judge rebuked you publicly for your inflammatory rhetoric that threatened to taint jury proceedings with the specter of mob violence. But that wasn't an isolated incident, was it? Let's look at your broader pattern of encouraging confrontation and harassment." He pulled out another transcript, this one from 2018. "On June 25, 2018, you spoke at a rally in Los Angeles and told your supporters, and I'm quoting your exact words, 'If you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd and you push back on them and you tell them they're not welcome anymore anywhere.'" Cruz's voice rose with controlled anger. "You called for organized harassment of government officials. You specifically told people to surround them, to create crowds, to push back on them, to make them feel unwelcome everywhere they went. And what happened, Congresswoman? What were the consequences of your words?" He pulled out news article after news article, each one documenting incidents of harassment and confrontation. Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen was surrounded by protesters in a Mexican restaurant and driven from the establishment while trying to eat dinner. White House advisor Stephen Miller was confronted and accosted while dining out. Senator Mitch McConnell was harassed at a restaurant. Senator Susan Collins received death threats. I myself was surrounded by an aggressive mob while having dinner with my wife, forcing us to leave through the kitchen for our safety. Cruz's eyes bored into Waters with laser intensity. "Your words had consequences, ma'am. You created a climate where political opponents couldn't appear in public without being mobbed, harassed, and threatened. You normalized political violence and intimidation. And then you have the extraordinary hypocrisy to accuse others of inciting insurrection when your own record is filled with calls for confrontation and mob action." The hearing room was absolutely silent. Even Waters' most loyal Democratic allies couldn't defend her against this documented record of incitement. Cruz pressed his advantage, moving in for the final kill. "Let's review the facts one more time for the American people watching," Cruz said, his voice taking on the formal tone of a prosecutor delivering closing arguments. "Maxine Waters has served in Congress for 34 years. In that time, she has been named one of the most corrupt members of Congress by the nonpartisan watchdog group Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington on 4 separate occasions: 2005, 2006, 2009, and 2011. She arranged federal bailouts for a bank where her family had massive financial holdings, protecting her personal wealth with taxpayer money. She has systematically enriched her relatives through her political connections, with family members making over $1 million from businesses and campaigns that benefited from her influence. She has repeatedly called for confrontation, harassment, and mob action against her political opponents. And then she has the audacity to lecture others about corruption, constitutional violations, and political violence." Cruz stood now, a rare gesture during congressional testimony, his full height commanding the attention of every person in the chamber. "Congresswoman Waters, you asked what qualifies me to discuss constitutional law and banking regulation. Let me answer that question definitively. I graduated from Harvard Law School magna cum laude. I clerked for Chief Justice William Rehnquist of the Supreme Court. I served as Solicitor General of Texas, where I defended constitutional principles before state and federal courts. I have argued 9 cases before the Supreme Court of the United States and never lost a single one. I have spent my entire professional career studying, practicing, and defending the Constitution of the United States." His voice rose with righteous authority. "But more importantly than my credentials, I have never used my public office to enrich myself or my family. I have never arranged federal bailouts for companies where I have financial interests. I have never told violent mobs to get more confrontational. I have never called for the systematic harassment of my political opponents. I have actually read and understood the Constitution I swore to uphold, and I have consistently fought to limit government power rather than expand it for personal benefit." Cruz picked up his worn pocket Constitution and held it aloft like a sacred text. "This document, Congresswoman, is not a suggestion. It's not a set of guidelines that politicians can ignore when they become inconvenient. It is the supreme law of the land, and it establishes a government of limited, enumerated powers specifically designed to prevent people like you from using public office for private gain." He opened the Constitution to a marked page and began reading with the authority of someone who had memorized these passages decades ago. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8. "No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and no person holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of the Congress, except of any present, emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever, from any king, prince, or foreign state." The founders included this clause, known as the Emoluments Clause, because they understood that politicians would be tempted to use their positions for personal enrichment. They knew that unchecked power leads inevitably to corruption. Cruz closed the Constitution and pointed it at Waters like a weapon. "You have violated the spirit of that clause for 34 years. You may not have accepted payments from foreign governments, but you have done something arguably worse. You have used your position to enrich your family through domestic corruption, through bailouts and favorable treatment and political connections that turned your public office into a private profit center. You have become exactly what the founders feared, a politician who views government power as a tool for personal advancement rather than public service." The camera operators in the gallery zoomed in on Waters' face, capturing for posterity the moment when a 3-decade political career reached its absolute nadir. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Her makeup was completely ruined, dark streaks of mascara creating grotesque patterns across her cheeks. Her mouth hung slightly open as if she wanted to speak, but couldn't form coherent words. Her hands trembled visibly on the table. The powerful, feared, untouchable Maxine Waters had been reduced to a broken shell of her former self in less than 90 minutes. But Cruz had one final blow to deliver, the piece of evidence that would ensure Waters could never recover from this public destruction. He reached into his folder one last time and pulled out a financial document that made Waters audibly gasp when she recognized it. "Congresswoman, let's talk about your net worth," Cruz said, his voice now carrying the cold precision of a forensic accountant presenting evidence of systematic fraud. "When you first entered Congress in 1990, your required financial disclosure form reported that your net worth was approximately $400,000, a respectable middle-class accumulation for someone your age at that time." He placed that document down and picked up a more recent one. "Your most recent financial disclosure, filed in 2022, reports that your net worth is now conservatively estimated at between $6 and $10 million, with some analysts suggesting it could be significantly higher depending on how various assets are valued." Cruz pulled out a calculator and began working through the mathematics with deliberate slowness, ensuring that everyone watching understood the implications. "Let's be conservative and use the $6 million figure. That means your net worth increased by approximately $5.6 million over 32 years of public service. Your congressional salary during that time never exceeded $193,000 per year. Even if you never spent a single penny on living expenses, never paid taxes, saved every dollar of your salary for 32 years, you would have accumulated approximately $6.1 million. But of course you did have living expenses. You maintained multiple residences, one in California and one in Washington, D.C. You raised children. You paid taxes. So where did the additional millions come from, Congresswoman? The question hung in the air like an accusation that could not be deflected or explained away with innocent justifications. Your husband had some business success, Cruz continued, but according to tax returns that were leaked during previous ethics investigations, his business income was modest and couldn't account for the massive wealth accumulation. Your children received significant income, but that came from political connections to your office, which we've already documented as corruption. So where did the millions come from? He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent chamber. They came from exactly what we've documented today: bailouts for banks where you had financial interests, consulting fees paid to family members by companies seeking favorable treatment, speaking fees from organizations that wanted access to your power, book deals structured to disguise what were essentially bribes, investment opportunities offered exclusively to powerful politicians who could provide favorable regulatory treatment. It's a system, Congresswoman, a comprehensive, systematic conversion of political power into personal wealth, and you've been operating that system for 34 years. Cruz gathered all his documents and placed them back in the manila folder with careful precision, the symbolic gesture indicating that his presentation of evidence was complete. The founders of this nation understood that the greatest threat to liberty was not external enemies but internal corruption. They designed a constitutional system with checks and balances, separation of powers, and limited government specifically, to prevent the accumulation of unchecked power by people who would inevitably be tempted to abuse it. They created a government of laws, not men, where even the most powerful officials would be constrained by constitutional limits and subject to accountability. His voice took on an almost sorrowful tone. Congresswoman Waters, you have spent 34 years systematically violating every principle that the founders established. You have accumulated power without accountability. You have enriched yourself and your family through your public position. You have called for violence and confrontation against your political opponents. You have demonstrated complete ignorance of the constitutional limits on governmental authority. You are not a public servant, ma'am. You are a cautionary tale about what happens when politicians forget that in America, they are servants of the people, not masters of them. The silence that followed was absolute and crushing. Not a single committee member spoke. Not a single staffer moved. Even the reporters in the gallery seemed frozen, recognizing that they had just witnessed something unprecedented in American political history: the complete, systematic, documented destruction of a 3-decade political career broadcast live to millions of Americans. Maxine Waters sat utterly defeated, unable to respond, unable to defend herself, unable to do anything except stare at the table in front of her and contemplate the ruins of everything she had built over 34 years in Congress. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was actually only 45 seconds of absolute silence, Senator Grassley cleared his throat nervously and spoke in a shaky voice. Congresswoman Waters, do you wish to respond to Senator Cruz's presentation? His choice of the word presentation rather than questions or accusations was telling. Even the Republican committee chairman recognized that what had just occurred transcended normal congressional hearing protocols. Waters lifted her head slowly, her ravaged face a mask of defeat and humiliation. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible, a hoarse whisper that the microphone barely captured. I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and will not answer any further questions at this time. The admission was devastating. By invoking the Fifth Amendment, Waters was essentially admitting that answering questions about her conduct might incriminate her in criminal activity. It was the refuge of mobsters and drug dealers, not supposedly honorable public servants. The legal and political implications were staggering. If Waters believed she could be criminally prosecuted based on testimony about her actions, then everything Cruz had documented was not just unethical but potentially illegal. Cruz nodded slowly, as if he had expected exactly this response. The Fifth Amendment is an important constitutional protection, Congresswoman. I respect your decision to invoke it, but I want the American people watching at home to understand what that invocation means. It means that when faced with documented evidence of corruption, when confronted with her own ethics violations and family enrichment schemes, when asked to explain how she accumulated millions in wealth on a government salary, Maxine Waters chooses to hide behind constitutional protections rather than provide honest answers. He stood and gathered his materials, preparing to leave the witness table. The irony, of course, is that you spent the first part of this hearing attacking my understanding of the Constitution, questioning my credentials, and suggesting that I didn't respect constitutional principles. But when your own conduct is examined in light of constitutional standards and legal requirements, you immediately invoke constitutional protections to avoid accountability. That tells us everything we need to know about your 34 years in Congress. Grassley, clearly desperate to end the hearing before further damage could be done, quickly gavelled the session to a close. This hearing is adjourned. The committee thanks all witnesses for their testimony and participation. The perfunctory closing couldn't disguise the fact that everyone in the room understood they had witnessed political history, a moment that would be studied and discussed for generations, as an example of how constitutional knowledge and documented evidence could triumph over institutional power and political connections. As Waters was escorted from the chamber by her security detail and remaining staff members, she kept her head down, refusing to make eye contact with anyone, her arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to physically hold together the shattered pieces of her political identity. The flashbulbs from hundreds of cameras created a strobe effect that made her exit look like a series of still photographs documenting the fall of a dynasty. Her staff followed in shocked silence, their phones already exploding with calls and messages from reporters, political allies, and donors, all asking the same questions. How bad is the damage? Can she recover? Should we distance ourselves immediately? Behind them, Ted Cruz remained at the witness table for several minutes after the chamber had largely emptied, methodically organizing his documents and placing them carefully back in his worn manila folder. His chief of staff approached cautiously, unsure whether to congratulate or console. "Senator, that was. I've never seen anything like that in 20 years of working in Congress. Every network is covering it. Social media is exploding. You're trending #1 on every platform." Cruz looked up with tired eyes that showed the emotional toll of what he had just done. "I didn't do this for political gain or media attention. I did it because someone had to. Because we can't call ourselves a constitutional republic if the people with the most power are never held accountable for their corruption. Because the American people deserve to know that their representatives are using public office for private enrichment." He closed the folder with finality and stood up, stretching his back after 90 minutes of intense confrontation. Maxine Waters is not unique. She's just the most visible, the most powerful, the most brazen example of a system that has rotted from the inside. There are dozens, maybe hundreds of members of Congress who have done exactly what she did: enriched themselves and their families, violated ethics rules, used their positions for personal gain. They've gotten away with it for so long that they believed they were untouchable. Today, we proved they're not. His aide pulled out his phone to show Cruz the social media reaction. Twitter was dominated by clips from the hearing. "Constitutional scholar destroys Waters" was trending nationwide. The moment when Waters invoked the Fifth Amendment had already been turned into countless memes. Conservative commentators were hailing Cruz as a hero who had finally held the Washington establishment accountable. Even some liberal commentators, unable to defend Waters' documented corruption, were grudgingly acknowledging that Cruz had presented a compelling case. but the implications extended far beyond one hearing or one disgraced congresswoman. In the days and weeks that followed, the political landscape began shifting in ways that political scientists would spend years analyzing and documenting. The Cruz Waters hearing, as it became known in political shorthand, had demonstrated something profound and potentially transformative about American politics. That constitutional expertise and documented evidence could still triumph over institutional power and partisan protection, but only if someone had the courage to present that evidence regardless of political consequences. Within 48 hours of the hearing, three major developments occurred that demonstrated the immediate impact of Waters' public destruction. First, the House Ethics Committee, under pressure from public outrage and facing renewed scrutiny of their previous decision to essentially exonerate Waters, announced they would reopen their investigation into her conduct regarding One United Bank and her family's financial dealings. The announcement carefully avoided admitting that their previous investigation had been inadequate or corrupted by political considerations, but everyone understood that Cruz's presentation had made it politically impossible to continue protecting Waters from accountability. Second, the Department of Justice released a terse statement indicating that they were reviewing materials related to potential violations of federal ethics laws and banking regulations by current and former members of Congress. The statement didn't name Waters specifically, but every political reporter in Washington understood exactly what it meant. Federal prosecutors were seriously considering criminal charges related to the corruption that Cruz had documented. The decision to announce an investigation so quickly after a congressional hearing was virtually unprecedented and signaled that the Justice Department believed the evidence was strong enough to potentially warrant prosecution. Third, and perhaps most significant for Waters personally, Democratic leadership in the House quietly asked her to step down from all her committee assignments pending the outcome of the ethics investigation. The request was framed as a temporary measure to avoid any appearance of impropriety, but everyone recognized it for what it was: the Democratic Party distancing itself from a toxic figure whose corruption had been exposed so thoroughly that continued association represented a political liability. Nancy Pelosi, who had protected Waters for decades, released a carefully worded statement that praised Waters' years of service, while noting that serious allegations require serious investigation. The statement included no defense of Waters' conduct, no claim that the allegations were false or politically motivated. It was the political equivalent of a death sentence, a public acknowledgement that Waters' career was effectively over. The media coverage in the week following the hearing was overwhelming and nearly universal in its conclusion that Cruz had delivered one of the most devastating political takedowns in modern American history. CNN, despite their general hostility to Republican politicians, ran extensive segments analyzing the constitutional arguments Cruz had made and the documented evidence he had presented. Their legal analysts, many of whom had initially dismissed Cruz as a partisan hack, were forced to acknowledge that his constitutional scholarship was sound and his evidence was compelling. Whatever you think of Ted Cruz's politics, one CNN legal commentator admitted on air, you have to acknowledge that he presented a masterclass in how to conduct a congressional investigation. He had documents for every claim. He anticipated every defense. He systematically dismantled Waters' credibility piece by piece. It was devastating, and based on the evidence presented, completely justified. Fox News, predictably, celebrated Cruz's performance as vindication of conservative warnings about Democratic corruption. They ran the highlights on a continuous loop, with commentary from legal experts and former prosecutors who praised Cruz's preparation and presentation. "This is what accountability looks like," one Fox analyst declared. "For too long, powerful Democrats have used their positions to enrich themselves while hiding behind partisan protection. Ted Cruz just proved that sunlight really is the best disinfectant. He brought the receipts, and Waters had no defense except to plead the fifth." Even left-leaning outlets like MSNBC and the New York Times, which had defended Waters for years, found themselves unable to mount an effective defense of her conduct once the evidence had been presented so comprehensively. MSNBC ran segments focusing on what went wrong, with congressional ethics oversight rather than directly defending Waters, a clear signal that they recognized her position was indefensible. The New York Times published a long investigative piece examining the broader culture of corruption in Congress, using Waters as a case study, but extending the analysis to include members of both parties who had enriched themselves through their positions. The most significant development occurred 2 weeks after the hearing, when the California Democratic Party, facing mounting pressure from voters and donors, formally withdrew its endorsement of Waters for her upcoming re-election campaign. The move was virtually unprecedented. Political parties almost never abandon incumbent members of Congress, especially senior members with Waters' seniority and institutional power. But the evidence Cruz had presented, combined with Waters' decision to invoke the Fifth Amendment rather than defend her conduct, made continued support politically toxic. Local Democratic leaders in Waters' district, emboldened by the party's withdrawal of support, began publicly calling for her resignation. Community activists who had long suspected corruption but lacked documentation to prove it now felt empowered to demand accountability. Small business owners, working-class families, and longtime constituents who had supported Waters for decades expressed betrayal and anger that she had enriched her family while claiming to fight for working people. "I voted for Maxine Waters 7 times," one constituent told a local news reporter outside Waters' district office. "I believed she was fighting for us, for people like me who are struggling to get by. Finding out that she was using her position to make her family rich while arranging bailouts for banks, I feel stupid. I feel used. She betrayed us." The sentiment was echoed across Waters' district and beyond, as Americans of all political persuasions recognized that Waters represented everything wrong with career politicians who view public service as a path to personal enrichment rather than a sacrifice made for the common good. 3 weeks after the hearing, facing multiple investigations, abandoned by her party, and with her reputation in ruins, Maxine Waters announced she would not seek re-election. The statement was brief and notably lacking in any admission of wrongdoing or apology for her conduct. "After 34 years of fighting for working families and social justice, I have decided to retire from Congress to focus on my family and my health. I am proud of my record and the progressive causes I have championed throughout my career." The refusal to acknowledge her corruption, the continued insistence that she had been fighting for working families, even as evidence proved she had been enriching her own family, demonstrated a level of denial and self-delusion that political psychologists would study for years. For Ted Cruz, the hearing represented a transformation in his political identity and national profile. He had entered the chamber as a polarizing figure known primarily for his confrontational style and his conflicts with both Democratic opponents and Republican establishment leaders. He emerged as something different, a serious constitutional scholar who had demonstrated that principle and preparation could triumph over institutional power. Speaking requests flooded his office from universities, think tanks, and civic organizations across the political spectrum. Conservative groups wanted him to teach their activists how to use constitutional arguments effectively. Liberal law schools, despite their ideological opposition to his politics, invited him to speak about constitutional interpretation and the limits of governmental power. The Federalist Society, the influential conservative legal organization, asked him to deliver their annual Barbara K. Olson Memorial Lecture, their most prestigious speaking invitation. Cruz used his enhanced platform not to seek personal glory, but to push for systemic reforms that would prevent future Maxine Waters from emerging. He introduced the Congressional Accountability and Ethics Reform Act, legislation designed to strengthen disclosure requirements, create real penalties for ethics violations, and establish an independent investigatory body with actual enforcement power, rather than the toothless House and Senate ethics committees that had failed to hold Waters accountable for decades. The bill included provisions that directly addressed the corruption Cruz had documented: mandatory disclosure of all stock trades within 48 hours, a complete ban on stock trading by members of Congress and their immediate family members in any sector, that their committees oversee criminal penalties for arranging government benefits for institutions where members have financial interests, and term limits of 12 years for all members of Congress to prevent the accumulation of unchecked power. The legislation faced fierce opposition from members of both parties who benefited from the current system of legalized corruption, but public pressure following the Waters scandal gave it momentum that no amount of backroom dealing could stop. Within 6 months, a modified version of the bill passed both houses of Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support, a testament to how thoroughly Cruz's destruction of Waters had changed the political calculation around ethics reform. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the hearing was the effect it had on a generation of young Americans who watched it and decided they wanted to be part of reforming rather than perpetuating the corrupt system. Law school applications surged, with applicants specifically citing the Cruz Waters hearing as inspiration for wanting to study constitutional law. Political science departments reported increased enrollment in courses on ethics, constitutional government, and political accountability. Civic education organizations saw dramatic increases in participation as Americans sought to better understand the founding principles that Cruz had wielded so effectively. The hearing became required viewing in high school civics classes, college political science courses, and law school constitutional law seminars. Professors across the country used it as a teaching tool, not just for its substantive content, but as an example of how preparation, knowledge, and principle could overcome entrenched power. Conservative legal organizations created training programs based on Cruz's methodology, teaching young lawyers and activists how to document corruption, present evidence effectively, and ground their arguments in constitutional principle. The broader cultural impact was equally significant. For years, Americans had grown increasingly cynical about politics, believing that corruption was inevitable and that powerful politicians would never face real accountability. The Cruz Waters hearing challenged that cynicism by demonstrating that accountability was possible when someone had the courage to pursue it and the documentation to prove it. Public trust in Congress, which had been at historic lows for over a decade, showed slight but measurable improvement in polling conducted after the hearing. The improvement wasn't dramatic. One hearing couldn't undo decades of institutional failure, but it suggested that Americans were willing to give the system another chance if they believed corrupt officials would actually face consequences. The transformation in Cruz's own political trajectory was remarkable. Before the hearing, he had been viewed by many as a talented but polarizing figure who seemed more interested in confrontation than governance. After the hearing, he was seen as something different, a serious legislator who could back up his rhetoric with substance, someone who understood that effective political combat required preparation and evidence rather than just sound bites and partisan attacks. When Cruz published his detailed account of preparing for the hearing in a book titled Constitutional Accountability: How Documentation Defeated Corruption, it became an instant bestseller, reaching #1 on the New York Times bestseller list and remaining there for 16 weeks. The book provided a behind-the-scenes look at how he and his staff had spent 3 weeks building the case against Waters, tracking down documents, verifying sources, anticipating defenses, and preparing for every possible response she might offer. Young congressional staffers across Washington devoured the book, using it as a manual for how to conduct effective oversight investigations. Law students cited it in papers about constitutional interpretation and governmental accountability. Political activists used it as a guide for holding their own representatives accountable to constitutional principles and ethical standards. But perhaps most importantly, the book inspired ordinary Americans to demand better from their elected officials and to hold them accountable when they failed to meet constitutional and ethical standards. The epilogue to the Waters scandal came 18 months after the hearing, when federal prosecutors finally concluded their investigation and filed criminal charges. Maxine Waters was indicted on 4 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of ethics violations, and 3 counts of conspiracy to defraud the United States. Her husband, Sidney Williams, was indicted on 6 related counts. Her grandson and former Chief of Staff Michael Moore was indicted on 8 counts related to his role in facilitating the One United Bank bailout and the family enrichment scheme. The trial lasted 6 weeks and featured testimony from Treasury officials, bank executives, ethics investigators, and financial experts who systematically documented the corruption that Cruz had first exposed in that Senate hearing. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the documents Cruz had presented, which he had turned over to federal investigators immediately after the hearing concluded. Waters' defense team attempted to argue that she had acted in good faith to help minority-owned banks and that any benefit to her family was coincidental rather than intentional. But the timeline was too perfect, the coordination too obvious, the pattern too consistent to explain as mere coincidence. The jury deliberated for less than 12 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for Waters, her husband, and her grandson. At sentencing, the federal judge, a Clinton appointee with a reputation for leniency toward white-collar criminals, surprised observers by imposing significant prison time. Waters received 8 years in federal prison. Her husband received 6 years. Her grandson received 4 years. In her sentencing remarks, the judge spoke directly to the broader implications of the case and why she felt substantial punishment was necessary despite Waters' age and health issues. Mrs. Waters, you held a position of extraordinary trust and responsibility. The American people elected you to represent their interests, to fight for their welfare, to exercise governmental power on their behalf and subject to constitutional constraints. Instead, you systematically betrayed that trust for 34 years. You used your position to enrich yourself and your family. You arranged bailouts for institutions where you had financial interests. You violated ethics rules and federal laws repeatedly and without apparent remorse. The judge paused, looking directly at Waters, who sat hunched and defeated at the defense table. What makes your conduct particularly egregious is not just the corruption itself, though that is serious enough. It is the hypocrisy. Throughout your career, you positioned yourself as a champion of working families, a fighter against corporate greed and Republican corruption. You built your entire political identity on moral righteousness and progressive values, all while you were systematically looting the public trust for private gain. The judge's voice hardened. This sentence is intended to send a clear message to every elected official in America. Public service is a sacred trust, not a business opportunity. Your power comes from the people and must be exercised for their benefit, not yours. When you violate that trust, when you use public office for private enrichment, you don't just commit crimes against the legal code. You commit crimes against democracy itself. You undermine the very foundation of representative government. Maxine Waters, 85 years old and in failing health, was remanded to federal custody immediately. The image of her being led from the courtroom in handcuffs, her once powerful frame diminished and broken, became another iconic moment in the saga that had begun with Ted Cruz opening a manila folder in a Senate hearing room. For Ted Cruz, the conclusion of the legal case represented vindication of everything he had argued during that hearing. He released a brief statement following the sentencing. Justice has been served, not just for the specific crimes Maxine Waters committed, but for the principle that in America, no one is above the law. Public officials who betray the trust of the people they serve must face consequences, regardless of their power, their seniority, or their political connections. This case proves that constitutional accountability is not just an abstract ideal, but a practical reality when citizens demand it, and officials have the courage to pursue it. The final chapter of the story played out over the following years as the reforms Cruz had championed were implemented and began changing the culture of Congress. The mandatory disclosure requirements made it much harder for members to hide corrupt financial dealings. The ban on stock trading in sectors they oversee closed the loophole that Waters and countless others had exploited. The Independent Ethics Commission, staffed with former prosecutors and judges rather than partisan politicians, began conducting real investigations with meaningful consequences. The changes weren't perfect, And corruption didn't disappear entirely from American politics. But the system had been reformed in ways that made it significantly harder for future Maxine Waters to emerge and thrive. Members of Congress understood that the era of consequence-free corruption had ended, that documentation and constitutional accountability could destroy even the most powerful careers. The Cruz Waters hearing became a cultural touchstone, referenced whenever discussions turned to political corruption, constitutional governance, or the accountability of public officials. Law professors taught it as an example of effective advocacy and constitutional argumentation. Political scientists studied it as a case study in how institutions could reform themselves when faced with undeniable evidence of systemic failure. Ethics instructors used it to teach about the consequences of betraying public trust. For a generation of Americans who had grown cynical about politics and resigned to the inevitability of corruption, the hearing and its aftermath represented something more profound: hope. Hope that the system could work if enough people demanded accountability. Hope that powerful officials could be brought to justice when their crimes were documented and exposed. Hope that constitutional principles and ethical standards still meant something in American governance. Hope that one person with courage, preparation, and principle could still change the trajectory of political history. Years later, when Senator Ted Cruz finally decided not to seek re-election after serving 3 full terms, he reflected on his career in a farewell address to the Senate. He spoke about many accomplishments and many disappointments, victories and defeats that had marked his time in public service. But when asked by a reporter what he considered his most significant contribution to American political life, his answer was immediate and unequivocal. "The Maxine Waters hearing," he said without hesitation. Not because it destroyed one corrupt politician's career, though that needed to happen, but because it demonstrated something essential about American democracy: that constitutional knowledge and documented evidence can still triumph over institutional power and corruption. That accountability is possible when someone has the courage to demand it. That the founding principles of limited government and ethical public service are not just historical artifacts but living standards that can hold officials accountable even today. He paused, choosing his words carefully. We live in an era of deep cynicism about politics and government. People believe the system is rigged, that powerful officials will never face consequences, that corruption is just the price of doing business in Washington. The Waters hearing proved that cynicism wrong. It showed that when corruption is documented, when constitutional principles are articulated clearly, when someone is willing to present evidence regardless of political cost, accountability is still possible. That's the lesson I hope endures long after everyone has forgotten my name. The reporter, sensing the historical significance of the moment, asked one final question. "Do you think the reforms that followed the hearing have permanently changed Congress, or will corruption eventually return to the levels you exposed?" Cruz smiled, the expression both hopeful and realistic. "Corruption is the eternal temptation of power. As long as humans hold political office, some will be tempted to abuse that power for personal gain. The founders understood this, which is why they designed a constitutional system with checks and balances, separation of powers, and limited government. They knew that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, that every generation must fight the same battle against corruption and abuse of power." His expression grew more serious. "The reforms we passed after the Waters scandal have made corruption harder and consequences more certain. But they're only effective if Americans remain engaged, if voters hold their representatives accountable, if journalists investigate rather than just report press releases, if citizens actually understand the Constitution and demand that officials respect its limits. The battle for ethical government and constitutional governance never ends. It's a constant struggle that requires constant vigilance. What we accomplished with the Waters hearing and the reforms that followed is not a permanent victory. It's a reminder of what's possible when people refuse to accept corruption as inevitable and demand better from those who serve in public office." The words proved prophetic. In the years that followed, new scandals emerged, new corrupt officials were exposed, and new battles for accountability were fought. But the template established by the Cruz hearing endured. Document everything, ground arguments in constitutional principle, present evidence systematically, and never back down from holding power accountable to the law. For Maxine Waters herself, there was no redemption arc, no opportunity for rehabilitation or forgiveness. She served her 8-year sentence in a federal prison in California, largely forgotten by the political establishment that had once feared and courted her. When she was finally released at age 93, she lived out her remaining years in obscurity, a cautionary tale about the ultimate fate of those who betray the public trust. Her family scattered, her wealth depleted by legal fees and restitution payments, her legacy reduced to a warning about the corrupting influence of unchecked power and the inevitable consequences of systematic ethical violations. She died at 96, and her obituary in major newspapers led not with her legislative accomplishments, but with the hearing that had destroyed her career, the corruption that had defined her legacy, and the prison sentence that had marked her final years. For Ted Cruz, the Waters hearing remained the defining moment of a long political career. When historians wrote about the early 21st century and the reforms that slowly began to restore some measure of integrity to American government, they invariably began with that Senate Banking Committee hearing room, with a Harvard-educated constitutional scholar systematically destroying a 3-decade career of corruption, armed with nothing more than a manila folder full of documents and an unwavering commitment to constitutional principles and ethical governance. The hearing became a symbol, a reminder that in America, knowledge can still triumph over power, that principle can defeat corruption, that accountability remains possible when citizens demand it and officials have the courage to pursue it. It was proof that the founding vision of limited government, ethical public service, and constitutional accountability was not just historical nostalgia, but a living standard that could hold even the most powerful officials to account. As the decades passed and new generations of Americans learned about the Cruz hearing in their civics classes and constitutional law courses, the story took on almost mythic quality, a modern parable about the eternal struggle between power and accountability, corruption and principle, institutional protection and constitutional justice. And at the heart of that story was a simple truth that resonated across political divides and ideological differences. In America, no one, absolutely no one, is supposed to be above the law. Not the richest, not the most powerful, not those with the most seniority or the strongest political connections. When officials betray the public trust, when they use power for private gain, when they corrupt the institutions they are sworn to serve, they must face consequences. That principle, more than any specific policy or legislative achievement, was Ted Cruz's enduring contribution to American political life. He had proven that constitutional accountability was not just an abstract ideal, but a practical reality that could be achieved when someone had the courage to demand it and the documentation to prove it. And in doing so, he had given hope to millions of Americans who believed the system was irredeemably corrupt, that reform was possible, that justice could prevail, that the founding principles of ethical governance and constitutional limits on power were not dead but merely dormant, waiting for someone with the knowledge and courage to bring them back to life. If this story of corruption exposed, justice served, and constitutional principles vindicated moved you, if it reminded you that accountability in government is not just possible but essential to preserving democracy, then I need you to do something right now. Smash that like button to tell the algorithm that this kind of content matters, that Americans care about holding their representatives accountable to constitutional standards. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss when we expose corruption and celebrate those brave enough to fight it. Share this video with everyone you know who still believes, or needs to believe again, that one person with courage and documentation can change history. Because the fight for ethical government never ends. The swamp is always there waiting to reclaim territory, and the only thing standing between accountability and corruption is an informed, engaged citizenry that refuses to let powerful officials operate above the law. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and never stop demanding that your government serves you rather than enriching those who hold temporary power. This is not just history. It's a blueprint for every future battle against corruption. And your engagement ensures that the next generation of leaders understands that constitutional accountability is not optional, it's mandatory.